Good morning, U.S. history class. We're going to talk about politics in the 1920s. The main question I want you to get out of this lecture was, how did the presidential policies of the 1920s contribute to the Great Depression? We'll first start with President Warren Harding, who takes office in 1921, only serves for 2 years because he has a heart attack. This is a guy, first of all, that didn't want to be president. He had been in the Senate. He loved the Senate because the workload was light. He felt like he'd been a member of a fancy gentleman's club, but his wife, Florence King DeWolf, was dead set on him becoming president. He referred to her as the Duchess, and she set up a campaign where women were voting for the first time and helped him win the 1920 presidential election. His philosophy on the economy was really a return to traditional Republican economic policies. And by that, I mean prior to the progressive era. So pre-Roosevelt, more like William McKinley, even before that. If you remember, I talked about the pendulum analogy. And during the Gilded Age, the president was very hands-off on the economy, and the role of government was to help support business. That changes during the progressive era, and the pendulum swings, where the government is much more hands-on the economy and regulating aspects of the economy. Harding's approach was to swing the pendulum back in the other direction, to have lower taxes, lower government spending, and really try to focus the emphasis of government on promoting business as opposed to regulating business. So we have a cartoon here. This is a cartoon written at the time, and what you can see going on in the cartoon is you have different elements of Washington, D.C. that are all for sale. First of all, over here, you have American institutions being bought, sold, and quoted. You have the White House being sold, the Washington Monument being sold. And the thing this says about Harding is that Harding was honestly not a very good president. He said he didn't want to be president, and he was taken advantage of by several members of his cabinet. And the one story I want to tell is a story about a place called Teapot Dome in Wyoming, which is where the government oil reserves were held. And his cabinet minister, the Secretary of the Interior, sold the American Navy's oil reserves, the oil it needed in reserve to have our ships be able to go around the world, sold them to private industry and profited himself, like took the money. He's the first cabinet member in American history to go to jail. Two of Warren Harding's friends committed suicide over this event, and it really highlights how corrupt the administration was within Harding's presidency. Warren Harding was a fan of poker. He liked to play poker in the White House, and he once lost an entire box of priceless White House china in a game of poker. He often drank while he was playing poker in the White House, which is ironic because this is during Prohibition when alcohol was illegal. He had supported Prohibition and supporting banning the purchasing of alcohol. So when Harding, in all the corruptness that he had in his White House, when he passed away from a heart attack in 1923, we have Calvin Coolidge become president. Calvin Coolidge is known as Silent Cal because he didn't really talk a whole lot. He did sleep often, and there are two stories about Silent Cal that I wanted to share. The first one is the First Lady, Grace Coolidge, was met at a state dinner by a woman who was going to be seated next to the president, and Mrs. Coolidge said to this person, "I'm sorry for you, you'll have to do all the talking yourself." Another woman approached the president at an engagement and said that she'd had a bet that she could get him to say more than 2 words that night. His only 2 words that night: "You lose." I guess there's one more story. Right? During the 1924 presidential election, this is a press conference. This is the text of a press conference. Reporter says, "Have you any statement from the campaign?" Coolidge says, "No." "Can you tell us something about the world situation?" "No." "Any information on Prohibition?" "No." And as they leave, the reporters are told by Coolidge to not quote him in that set of interactions. So he's not exactly known as a big talker. His approach to the economy is very similar to Harding. He really takes Harding's policies and continues to implement them. So very hands-off on the economy, no government regulations, no breaking up of trusts. The one difference is that he does feel that government should intervene directly to help businesses. So this is very similar to what was going on during the Gilded Age. So if the main question is how this relates to the Depression, I want to look at who benefits from these sets of policies versus who loses. The main group of people who benefit from these policies are investors. Investors in the stock market in particular in the mid-1920s were buying stocks on what at the time was called margin, which is the same as credit. So they were borrowing money, often from stockbrokers, investing that money in the stock market with the hopes that stock prices would go up and they would then sell the stock at a profit. This works very well during the mid-1920s. Stock prices soar. Between 1927 and 1929, the stock market basically doubles in value, and the companies that have stock being sold on the stock market are not actually doing that much better, but everyone is investing in the stock market, so there's a lot of demand for stocks. That demand drives up the price. It's an artificially created rise in the stock market, created artificially because the companies aren't actually doing better. It's just people want to invest in the stock market to make money. So investors doing very well in the 1920s. Business owners are doing very well. The amount of money that business owners have increases by 300% during the decade, which is a massive increase. This is one of the biggest increases in wealth creation during one decade. Workers do benefit, but workers' wages go up about 10% in the decade. So you can see in these two statistics, there's a massive disparity in the business owners and the workers in terms of who is benefiting during the 1920s. Many economists make the argument that this growing rich-poor gap was one of the reasons why the Depression happens in the 1930s. The people that are not doing well, the first one are farmers, and given your extensive knowledge of Grapes of Wrath, this should not be a total surprise. So after World War I, there is a big decline in demand for food products in the early 1920s. So World War I ends in 1918. America had been shipping grain primarily and corn over to Europe to help feed people in the aftermath of the end of World War I. But after the war ends, there is a decline in demand. That decline in demand reduces food prices. But these farmers had expensive mortgages and therefore had trouble paying for their mortgages. This is really, in many ways, a holdover from the populist movement in the 1890s. So the government implements a policy, this is more towards the late 1920s, to try to stabilize prices by buying up crops and then destroying them to try to eliminate the surplus of crops that existed that were pushing down demand. They don't do a whole lot of this in the mid-1920s, a little bit, but certainly not enough to help farmers. So in 1924, you have Calvin Coolidge running for election, and he wins a landslide election in 1924, serves until 1929, which brings us to Herbert Hoover, who runs in 1928 and wins and serves one term. His philosophy on the economy is a little bit different. It is overall very pro-business, but he really felt the government should work to help promote businesses, but in a way that is more progressive, in the sense that he wanted to not be as hands-off, not as laissez-faire on the economy, and have more interventions to help regulate businesses. He's also the president that deals with the stock market crash of 1929, which is the first topic that we'll deal with next Monday. That's all the stuff I wanted to say for today. We'll talk much more about Hoover during next week, but for right now, you should be able to explain what the philosophy that the presidents had in the 1920s, what their philosophy was on the economy, and then how that impacts different groups during the 1920s. Go team.